Halloween, everyone. We're back with a special spooky episode for you today. We're going to be talking about the witch trials. A year ago, Victoria and I went to Salem, Massachusetts in October. And at the time, we did not realize that wasn't a great idea, as it was packed with thousands of people.
Hordes and hordes of people.
It was so busy we could barely move, honestly, in the streets. It was fun, and we learned a lot.
And we saw a lot.
We saw a lot. It was good for people watching.
I didn't know that you are expected to come in costume.
A lot of costumes. It wasn't near Halloween. It was like the first weekend in October, I think. And there were a lot of costumes, a lot of witch hats.
A lot of interesting items being sold. It was a whole experience.
It was. And again, we had fun. We went to the Salem Witch Museum and we learned a lot. But it was packed, and we should have expected that, and that's why we did not go again this year in October. But regardless, a lot of people were treating Salem like it was some kind of witchy mecca. And it was kind of weird.
It was really weird, especially as you go through the museum and you hear all about the victims and the lives that were ended in Salem, the people that were literally burned alive, and then you walk out of the museum and everybody's dressed up as a witch and it's like this fun thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was this weird, like, juxtaposition of going into the museum and learning about this horrible tragedy, and then walking out and everyone is just completely ignoring it, and it's full commercialization of witchcraft.
And it wasn't just that they were making it into like a fun dress-up game. It was that so many people were profiting off of the tragedy of the witch trials.
Yeah. And the museum was not one of those organizations. No, they didn't
take issue with the museum.
They did a phenomenal job, but there's a park not too far from the museum that's just full of vendors selling as much crystal witch crap as they possibly can, and people are buying it up.
They're treating it like you're honoring the culture of the witches, when these were women and some men accused of being witches, which they were not. There's not some ancient culture that they're honoring here. It's that people were causing probably some kind of trouble in other ways, and to get rid of these people, they were accusing them of being witches and killed, so it's instead they're like, we're going to honor the witches and teach you how to sage your home. And it's like, no, you're just making money off of selling thousands of sage to people.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you all this, but witches are not real. And these were real victims that were just happen to be called witches because people wanted to get rid of these people for one way or another, for power,
right. Maybe for their land.
There's always some kind of reason for it that has nothing to do with witchcraft. And so it just felt weird and disrespectful that Salem has become this mecca for whatever this culture is.
Really weird, which, as I was researching for this episode, led me down this whole rabbit hole of dark tourism, which is what it's called when people like to travel to historic sites where tragedies occurred. And that's not always a bad thing, right? Like, if you want to go learn about the Holocaust, and you're going to do that in a respectful way to try and honor what happened there and learn from the history, and not just so that you can oddly smile and post it on Instagram. There's two different attitudes that happen there.
But the equivalent of that would be tourists going to Auschwitz dressed up like you are a prisoner there. And that is the equivalent of what this is, and it's super creepy.
It's hard to even listen to the end of that sentence. Yeah, I know. It's really, really awful. That's two ends of the coin when it comes to dark tourism, right? Is that you have people trying to do it honorably, and they want to take their families and teach them about history and do it respectfully in a way where they're like broadening their horizons and making it feel real to them and not just like, oh, I read it in history books, so I'm aware of it, but not in a tangible way.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are people that buy keychains at, you know, really horrific sites where thousands have died. So then you have the people that are peddling the keychains and stuff like that. So it's just the ethics of how are you operating that tourist company? How are you behaving as that tourist? And I found so much material. I mean, people are like writing their PhD dissertations on dark tourism and the ethics behind it, and why are we as a society growingly attracted to it. It's a growing trend to go to these places and to make it your summer holiday destination.
Yeah, and you know, I noticed this, it's not just going to these real locations, but how about the Netflix Jeffrey Dahmer show?
Yeah.
Or any of those serial killer shows or podcasts about actual crimes. Like, people are fascinated by this stuff.
Yes.
But to too much of a degree? Sometimes.
I've heard that there's a theory that it is a catharsis as the world that we are living in gets more dangerous, less idyllic, less American dream, white picket fence. The more that we have natural disasters and terrible things happening, there's like this catharsis of learning about what's already happened and it's in the past, and you can kind of like arm yourself out with the fallout. Like there's some kind of catharsis of like, that's over and done with and I wasn't a part of that, but I can like understand it and move on. I don't know to what extent that really is part of this trend or not. But there's something about understanding it from a safe distance because it is over and done with now.
Yeah. And for some of that is definitely true. For Salem, I think...
It's become kitschy almost, you know? And I was reading about Salem, Massachusetts as a town. They make between 99 million and 140 million a year, most of that during the fall. The town itself is concerned about diversifying so that they are not stuck in just making their tourism profits in the witch category. So they're like, we're also like a merchant city, and we're also, this and that, which... I don't know.
Well, they have
that's good or bad.
They have the House of the Seven Gables.
I thought that was really cool.
Which we went and saw, and they are a merchant town, and they have the tall. What are those called? The tall ships, or whatever. There's lots more to do stuff. There.
And the town is making an effort to try and embrace that, mostly for financial gain. But
of course. But notably, when we were there last October, our tour of the House of the Seven Gables was not full. There was like 7 of us, including the 2 of us. And, all the witch stuff downtown was so packed you could barely move.
Yeah. No, definitely. And people had gone so overboard in their outfits and their hair and makeup that you knew there were going to be photo shoots later, right? Like that was definitely a social media grab, which is... not what I associate going to, like, a tragic, historic place for.
Yeah.
But it's not like I'm so high and mighty. Like, I wasn't like, let's go to Salem, Massachusetts and be really solemn all day.
No, we enjoyed it, and we learned a lot.
Yeah.
It was just overboard with the witch culture.
It felt really odd, yeah.
Yeah. But, I can see what the town has done. Like, they turned their greatest shame into a source of profit and, historical reverence, at least they're trying to.
They've definitely flipped it.
They flipped the script,
yeah. Yep. Do you want to share kind of the message of the museum?
Well, a lot of it was specifically about the Salem witch trials and the people and the victims that went through that. And there was some interesting robotics, but
Yeah.
that probably need some updating. But anyways, after you go through that, you go into there's like this hall afterwards, but you learn about witch trials over history. And witch hunts and witch trials are more than just with actual witches. I mean, we have now used it in the political lexicon to describe any sort of investigation or any sort of sham that is not true, right? So, I mean, it was popularized in the 1950s during the Red Scare. After World War II, people were afraid of communists, and Senator Joseph McCarthy, a name you probably have heard, speculated that America was facing enemies within, and that would be communists. So that sparked large-scale investigations and efforts to root out communists from within our country. And between 1947 and 1965, 5 million federal employees were subjected to loyalty tests, which resulted in 2,700 dismissals and 12,000 resignations. Basically, none of them turned out to be communists. It was, by all intents and purposes, a witch hunt. And so the Salem Witch Museum and the book The Crucible, if you're familiar with that, compared the Salem witch trials to the Red Scare. But this is not something that is ever going to go away, at least in my opinion. Like, there's always going to be a group of others that people are demonizing or afraid of, and there's always going to be people who want power and will try to get rid of those people who are being demonized to gain more power. That'll always happen.
I think that's true, and that is kind of the mastermind plan, right, of trying to fool the public into going with your idea, believing your overarching, like, scheme to go after someone who doesn't want to follow your plan. Then all of a sudden they are the villain, right, and just flipping it on its head. And that happens today.
Just, I was thinking about some modern examples. The AIDS epidemic in like the 80s and 90s, and even still a little bit today with like monkeypox most recently. Mm-hmm. People are afraid of infection of this virus. And they were already not too friendly towards the gay community. So when this virus came out and was primarily targeting the gay community, it just became really easy to scapegoat and demonize them.
It's true, and that could be, I mean, I said like mastermind plan, but that could just be like something that you don't understand. It doesn't have to be like targeted, like always orchestrated.
It can be, but it's not always. Mm-hmm. The museum said fear plus trigger equals scapegoat. Like, that is the formula for a witch hunt. How about, this is another disease example, but COVID started in China. People were afraid of it.
Yeah.
And then people were demonizing Chinese Americans here.
And then that got generalized to Asian Americans.
Just Asian Americans,
and anyone of Asian descent that may or may not have lived in America their entire life.
Yeah.
Businesses were targeted.
I mean, logically, it didn't make any sense.
Does
but
it ever?
There's no logic, right? Yeah. Like, that's what makes this a witch hunt. There isn't logic to it. It's just fear that is leading this. You may or may not remember Donald Trump. He loved the term witch hunt. He tweeted out a bunch of times, specifically during the Mueller investigation, which he may have been right about. Well, time will tell. But, like, it's used to delegitimize investigations, for better or for worse. Sometimes things are a witch hunt. Sometimes the term is thrown around quite loosely. Another modern example would be the racist Great Replacement theory. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's that white people are afraid that people of color are going to come in and basically replace them in jobs and most aspects.
Oh no, I am familiar with this.
Yeah, no, it's not true. It's terrible, but it's another example of what is ultimately an illogical witch hunt.
Why can't we just use a little more critical thinking, huh?
Well, that's tough.
It's so much work.
Panicking is easier. Which brings me to another modern problem, the trans panic, which is going on right now.
It definitely is.
Yeah, we don't even have to describe what's going on with the trans community, and people are treating them like witches, so...
It's true, and I was just reading about how that goes so far as to affect child services, how people can call an anonymous tip to child services if they're seeing like their neighbor is letting their child dress non-traditionally according to their gender.
Mhm.
That is a reason to call the tip line and have someone come and visit the house, which whether or not that leads to anyone taking like a child out of their parents' custody, having like a social worker visit the house and see if you're a capable parent, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
That's definitely like very, very scary for both the parent and the child. And that's happening to teachers that are talking about gender too much, right? They could lose their job. All of this stuff is just getting super hypersensitized. Because what is the fear about being transgender? Why is it so awful? Why is it turning into a witch hunt?
Yeah, the calling the tip line on your neighbor thing in particular is very witch hunt. I mean, that's right out of Salem.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? And then there are so many other reasons. Like this harks back to why we've had to create laws of you cannot be evicted because you are gay. You cannot be evicted because you're of a minority race. You cannot be evicted because you are disabled. You should not be able to be evicted because you are transgender or have a transgender child. But landlords have called these tip lines to try to get the families out.
Oh, no.
Because they're uncomfortable with what's happening.
Oh, boy. Yeah. No, this is a good example. A fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat. And so here we are again. History repeats itself.
It does.
And it probably
just
always
finds
will.
a new outfit. It's insane.
It probably always will.
Yeah.
Of course, these are all metaphorical witch hunts. But there are still literal witch hunts happening in the world, in some, like, third world places. In Saudi Arabia, make an anti-witch unit in their government in, like, 2009. It's insane. Like, these things are actually still happening.
They did. And of course, just like back in Salem, whether or not they actually believe that anybody is a witch is highly questionable.
Of course, yeah.
Highly, highly questionable. Is this that people are getting too empowered and they need to find a way to control them again?
Well, these are some places in the world where, like, women...
That woman got a driver's license. Yeah. She's a witch!
Women do not have full rights, and so just one more way to oppress them.
I mean, it really fits.
Yeah. It was always used that way, so it's continued to be used that way, even in the modern age. And it's really sad.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking that parts of the world have not progressed, and that this day and age, some people are still being imprisoned by the same tricks that generations ago were harming them and their ancestors. And I just feel like while history does repeat itself, at least it tends to evolve, but it's shocking when it doesn't evolve in any form. It's just literally the exact same template.
Right. Over and over again.
I literally can't imagine what that's like to live in a place where you're not allowed to ever conceive that you would be an equal. And if you try, some lie is going to be spun about you, and everyone is just going to jump on board.
And your life is either ruined or taken away.
Right. So don't fight for a better life. It'll literally just be taken from you.
Yeah, and that's their goal, right? It's all about power. Always has been, because there aren't witches.
Of course not.
It's always power.
Unfortunately, I think that's the scariest thing this Halloween, is that the human race can be absolutely terrifying.
Truly. But we do recommend going and checking out the Salem Witch Museum. It actually is interesting and fun.
I would skip going in October.
Yeah, definitely don't go in October. Avoid the crowds, avoid all the witches, and, check it out in July or something.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of The Great Compromise. If you have any witch hunts that we did not cover in this episode, leave it in the comments and talk to us about it. In the meantime, follow us on Twitter, and Facebook, and Instagram, and YouTube, and we will see you next week.